Hi everybody, welcome to Missy's Imaginings and happy holidays. It is December 15th today, 2019 when I'm recording this, and I just wanted to say that there are 6 gifts of Christmas posted thus far. No, 7 gifts that are finished and on the website. So if you haven't been keeping up with that and you didn't know about that, if you go to the website, I'll link it below. There are 7 gifts posted thus far for the month of December, and by the time we get to Christmas Eve, there will be 12 total. So just so you know, that's happening, and 7 are finished and posted, and I have a few more to go. So 5 more to go. So we'll be getting those done and posted throughout the month. I try to do them very close to every other day, but sometimes they either have to double up or do one early depending on a schedule. So that's going on. But for today, I wanted to go ahead and finish up sewing the little office type outfit with the skirt, and then we did the blouse, and now we're going to do the jacket for the SD size BJD. And as you can tell in the thumbnail, it's just a little jacket. It has a little bit of flare at the hem, and it's just kind of a slim fitted coat. And so we're going to go ahead and put that together today so that you can see how to sew that. Later down the road, I may go ahead and do the pants and the vest as well, just so that we could have the complete set, but I'll kind of see how that goes. So today we're going to go ahead and move up the camera, and we'll go ahead and start sewing and putting that jacket together. And then, of course, at the end you can see what it looks like on the doll. So here we go. Happy sewing, and we'll get busy. The pieces for the jacket are all cut. So here we'll kind of go over what the pieces are. There's the 2 pieces of the back, and I'll go over why in a minute. The 2 pieces for 2 sleeves. The 2 pieces of the front, the 2 pieces of the side front, 2 pieces for the collar, 1 for a back lining, and 2 pieces for a front lining. So if you've watched the videos before, you know that I always do what I call prep sewing. I don't know if there's a proper term for it, but it's what I like to do to get pieces ready before I'm going to assemble the jacket. So on the back, we'll start up here on the top. The back is going to actually have a pleat in the back. So what I'm going to do as far as prep sewing is I'm going to serge the center back piece along that edge of both pieces of fabric. So that way when I sew the seam and one of those is folded back to make that open pleat at the bottom, both of the edges of that fabric will already be finished. And because in order to do that, you know, it has to be able to separate, you know, to have your pleat. And so I don't want any of that fabric to be raw edges. And then because that whole thing will already be finished, it'll add a little bit more bulk, but it's not too bad. And then I won't have to reserge it again once I put the seam in and connect those back pieces together. So the construction will come along a little bit later, but that's what I'm going to do to prep those. On the sleeves, I will serge the edge and then hem the end of the sleeves. Then on the collar, I will put both pieces together with right sides together. So we'll take on the fabric here, and this is one side has like a little pretty braid on the fabric, so you can tell which is the right side. So I'm going to put the right sides together. There we go. And I'll sew the upper edge of the collar and then trim that to 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, then flip it right side out, and then baste the bottom edge so that it just makes these 2 pieces into one piece for the collar. So that's what I do there. Then on the lining or the facing, I will put these 2 pieces and the back together at the shoulders, and then I will serge finish all the way around. Here, let's lay it out so it can show a little bit better. So it will be connected. There we go. Excuse me. My voice is still a little bit froggy from when I was sick, so it gets scratchy really easy. So these will be put together at the shoulder, and then this outside edge will be just inside the jacket, so I will finish that outside edge of the facing by serging around that edge. Now if you don't have a serger, that's okay. You can always still zigzag that edge. I would put my stitches not super close together because that can kind of rumple your fabric, but smaller than like a normal, you know, I don't know, like 1/8 of an inch stitch distance between the zigzags. Because that way it gives you a lot of good coverage, but you also want to be careful that you're not making it wrinkled because your stitches are so small that it wants to kind of bunch them up. But the other option is to have some good pinking shears and just cut along that edge, and that just puts a zigzag cut on the fabric, and it kind of helps it to keep from fraying. But I will give you a word of caution with pinking shears. If they are not really nice and sharp, they tend to kind of gum up when you're cutting fabric, especially if it's polyester. So if you're going to use pinking shears and you have some that are super sharp, that is another really good option, because you can cut that edge and then there is absolutely no extra bulk, because you actually finished the edge of the fabric itself. You haven't added any thread there. So those are some options you can do to finishing, and that's what I do to prep sew my pieces. So I will get that all done, and then I will come back to the camera and we'll start going through the steps for actual assembly. The prep sewing is all done now. So here is the facing. I put them together, and on these ones often I would use just the normal 1/4 inch serge, but I had it set up to do a rolled hem so that it's just a little bit almost like a little cord that forms on the edge of the fabric, and I just left it there because it doesn't take up much room and it was already set to that, so that's just where I left it. And yeah, so there's minimal serging on the fabric that way. And then on the shoulder seams, because this will be inside and these seams will never show, I just press them open. That's the least amount of bulk that's going to be in the shoulders. And then I also notched right here in the center of the back of the neckline so that I can easily line that up when I go to put the pieces together. I also notched the center of the bottom edge of the collar once that was put together, so that'll be easy to line up. And so those pieces are done. The hem on the sleeves is all done, so that looks nice. It's all finished. Then on the back, I went ahead and did the first seam, which is simply to put the right sides together and sew a 1/4 inch seam from the neckline down to where the pleat will open. So I went ahead and did that seam. So now to finish putting the back together, let's see if I can get it to open and get my hands out of the way. I am going to have the seam overlap from the left side on the back like this, and so that'll be the overlap side. So what I did to accomplish this is I pressed both pieces of that seam allowance towards the same side as the overlap. There we go. If that makes sense, so you can see. So this is folded, and is it on camera? There we go. And now what I want to do, just to help this lay the way that I want, it's just an option totally if you want to do it this way. You can have a complete open pleat and just press the whole thing open, but then your pleat will separate and there won't be any overlap of fabric. It would just be an open pleat. I want it to be an actual overlap of fabric, so I'm going to press the seam allowance one direction. I'm also going to top stitch that seam allowance down, so I'll top stitch on the side where there is the seam allowance, just down to where it opens here. And then I am also going to stitch this piece of fabric that folds. I'm going to stitch it in place so that it can't unfold and look kind of wonky like this. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch that. Then what happens is I have top stitching down this far, And then this seam, because I'm going to top stitch just this piece, it will give an even flush look of a seam down the back. So I won't have a top stitch seam, come to here and then just stop. That seam, although it won't be holding fabric together, it will continue on this piece to hold my pleat so that the fabric is positioned correctly. And then when that lays down, I'm not going to have to worry about this coming unfolded and looking kind of wonky. So that's what I'm going to do on the back. The next step then will be to take the front side pieces, here we go, and the front pieces, and I'm going to sew them together. So here we go, and I'm looking at, there we go, and move that out of the way, and this piece. So these are going to be sewn here, and there is kind of a little wonky curve, and so I'm going to start, and this will kind of have to be stretched around, but I'm going to start here, and this tip of the fabric right here is not going to be flush with this. It's actually going to be probably a 1/4 inch up, because it's the actual seam, let me grab my pin, is right here. That's where the actual seam line will be, and on here the actual seam line is here, where this seam and that seam come together. So we'll stick a pin in there, and we'll match up that pin, and so that way you can see how when I go to line up those pieces, see how this tip, it sticks out. That's because this is part of the seam allowance that extends. So I'm going to make sure that where I actually want the seam allowance to stop is going to be where I start my pin, and then I'm gently going to sew this edge all the way down, and it'll be going around a curve, which is sometimes not very fun. So I'm not going to pin that, and hopefully it will fit. I'm a little nervous about that because curves are always a little difficult. But that's going to be where I start. Now if you want the hemline to line up correctly, you can always start at the hemline and then sew up this way and then around. Here we go. And the fabric will bend, but then you're going to have, there we go, I guess that'll work, but then you're going to have this weird wonky tip because this is where the edge of the underarm is. So I'm going to try sewing from the top edge down, and then I'll just kind of have to trim my hemline and even that out. So we'll see what kind of luck I have there. And the other thing is, when I sew these pieces, I generally don't try to pin them because then it just gets really, really weird. So when I start the seam, I'll start it in place and I'll go a few stitches, and my fabric is actually going to lay like this. So it's crossed and it looks really weird, but then as I sew, I'm slowly going to bring those pieces together as I go through the machine and come around that corner, so that it ends up, my machine thinks I've sewn a straight line. The other thing that you can do that will help is to baste around this edge or stay stitch, but if you baste, you can actually kind of pull it and tug it to kind of add the pucker in here because you're going around such a sharp curve, and that will help the pivot of when you come down from the underarm down to like the point of the bust, and to be able to pivot around that corner and then come down, because you can see as I'm holding that in place to pull that and come down, then my hem has a lot better chance of matching up correctly. So you can baste this and just kind of pucker that in there and gather the fabric there so that it actually gathers around that point of the bust, and it'll help fit that better. So it's just an option, a couple different ways. Sometimes I'm too lazy to take that extra step because I kind of know I have to pivot right here anyway. And so those are just some hints that you can do. I'm not sure if the machine, sometimes if I try to film it, my hands get in the way and you can't see it anyway. just because my hands are all right here while I'm trying to do that. So I just kind of wanted to go over how I'm going to sew that. So I'll probably just do one and then come back to the camera and show you what that looks like. But that's going to be our next step on putting the fronts together. Once the fronts are completed, we will attach the fronts to the back at the shoulder seam. So that's a lot to go over real quick, but we'll go ahead and do these front pieces and then come back to the camera and show you the results of that. Well, I felt a little guilty about being a little lazy, so I went ahead and I did baste around that edge and then pulled it so that you can see how that's, hopefully you can see. Let me check here. I guess I'll get, I wonder if I can come up closer and if the lighting will cooperate. But you can see how that's a little puckered, and it just helps. See how it's kind of curving around, there we go, curving around my finger that way. So it just creates that curve, so it makes it a little easier to sew. And I thought, I talked about it, I need to just show that. So not be lazy, Missy, just go ahead and do it. So anyway, so if you go ahead and baste that, and then take the, I always pull on the thread that's on the front of the fabric, because it just gives less fabric to show if it shows through the seam allowance. And I'm not going for a look that's like real ruffled. I want it to still be relatively flat, but I just want it to curve around that shortened thread so that it makes that curve that will be on the front of the bust. So when you attach it, here we go, it'll just give that curve a little bit more natural of a lay when you put that together. So that's what we're going to do. I didn't cheat and just skip the step, so that way you can see if that would help you get that corner a little bit easier. Then there you go. Here is the front and the side front put together. So this is what it looks like. And you can tell, maybe, if I can, I'll grab my little turner. Here is the tip piece on that side front, and then here's the front, and I'll just put the little angle in here so you can see it against the white. So here is the tip of the front, and then this one is lower. So you can see how those tips don't match. And that's fine. It's just because you're using a weird angle there as you put those two together. And so the seam allowance is real puckery on the piece that has the outside of the curve, and then the inside of the curve is more straight. If you want to help that lay a little bit better on the piece that is the front piece seam allowance, you can actually snip just a couple little pieces of that seam allowance, and you can single snip it or put a little V in there. I'm just doing a V so it'll show against my fingernail, and that way it kind of helps for that to not have so much tension on that outer edge. And then this, of course, is going to have a little bit more pucker. So what I'll do is I will run this seam allowance through the serger, which will trim a little bit of that off and then also make that nice and finished. But when you gather that little bit around that bust line on that curve, it helps it lay in a little bit better. There we go. And it will be surprisingly close when you do the hem. It might be a little bit off, but that's only 1/4 inch, which I can easily just trim that off when I do the hem. But by puckering that, it just helps it lay in there a lot better. So hopefully that will show in the lighting. Let me see if I can check the camera while I'm doing this and not go completely out of focus. So there we go. So that's what it looks like when you get that side and front connected. And just putting that little gather in definitely helps for that to go together. So you're going to sew from up under the arm and the upper bust, and you're going to go to just would be the tip curve of that bust, and that's where you're going to pivot the side one to go around and pull around that corner and then match up as you come down. So I've got both the side fronts finished. There we go. So we'll put them out here. So here's the side fronts and the front put together. So these now will be connected to the back, and I still need to do the top stitching on the back because I was working on this. So I'll top stitch the back. I will go ahead and put the shoulders together with right sides together. I will top stitch on the shoulders just to add some stitching and tailoring there. And then the next step will be to come back to the camera so we can put in the collar and the facing. So that's what we'll do next when I come back to the camera. The back is now fully finished. I have the top stitching done on the top and on the pleat. So now when it is overlapping, there we go, you can kind of see what that looks like. And then underneath, this edge of the fabric that underlays the pleat is actually finished. So if that pleat were to open, it still looks nice. It's all finished. So now the shoulders are put together, and I did top stitch the seam allowance open. So I opened the seam allowance, and then I just simply started at the outside of the shoulder. I went in, turned, and came back, and I did that on both sides. Come in, turn, and go back out. That just helps that shoulder seam allowance lay a little bit more flat. In some jackets, you can actually make a little shoulder pad, but I'm not going to on this lady's jacket. I don't want to do it. So here is the facing. You may be wondering about the purple. An earlier video I did where I put the skirt together that goes with this little suit, I did purple in the lining, and then the little blouse that goes with it has some purple. So I just used some purple just to kind of tie the whole little outfit together, if you wondered why that was purple. So our collar with the notch is going to be placed so that this center of the notch matches with the center back seam. So I will lay that with raw edges of the neck together. So I'll lay that on there. And then the facing also will have the notch matched. And then the collar will be placed around the edge of the neckline, and then this will be pinned. So we'll actually have the collar sandwiched between the facing and the actual garment. Now to make, because you can tell that the neckline curves this way, but the collar curves the opposite way. So to make this easier, once again, we're going to use some stay stitching. I'm going to sew just a simple seam just inside what would be the seam allowance from the outside all the way around the neckline, and then I'm going to just snip at about 1/4 or 3/8 inch intervals all the way around the neckline, and I'll also snip on my collar here. Oh, I caught movement and I have a kitty down here on the floor next to me. So I'm going to go ahead and snip this seam allowance as well. And when you snip those pieces, you put in the stay stitching and snip the pieces, then you can kind of tell that those are pulling apart. It enables this piece especially because it's curved. When you snip those open, it enables that to lay more like a straight line, because where you've snipped, those little things are going to open, and so all those little snips will kind of open up and make that more of a straight line when you go to actually sew all three of those pieces together, because going around corners can sometimes really be a pain in the rear, especially on these small garments because the corners are so tight. So when you take the time, like I actually did, on putting in that stay stitching or basting, it just makes the actual assembly go with less headaches and go a lot smoother with less risk of puckers and pleats where you don't want them. So first I'm going to stay stitch around the edge of both of these pieces because the collar is already done. I'll finish snipping the collar. I'll also snip all the way around both of these necklines, and then I'll come back when we're going to go ahead and have that pinned together. all 3 layers have been sewn together. I started at the bottom of the hemline, went up one side of the front, across the neckline, pivoted, and came down the other front. A couple things to keep in mind when you're sewing across the neckline is, especially around the shoulders, as you're sewing here, you want to continually be kind of flattening and pulling the fabric that direction, like away from the seam, to help that lay a little bit flatter, because you want to avoid any wrinkles. And another thing is that you want to actually sew right at the seam line, but not further down into the fabric, because the further this way you go, away from the raw edge and in towards the fabric, then the more chance you have to get an actual wrinkle in, or a pleat in the fabric here, because you've got all this fullness. So it's kind of like, this might tend to look like a ruffle, if you can see that, but you don't want any ruffle pleats in the actual seam. So you want the seam allowance to be as flat as possible, and if you pull that fabric away from your seam, not like, you know, yanking it, but just gently keeping that straight, you'll have less of an opportunity for that fabric to buckle, because it's real easy for it to kind of like buckle like this and to catch that in the seam. So by pulling that fabric away, you're going to have less chance of that. So let's look on both sides, and I don't know if that'll show very well, but as I'm inspecting, I'm seeing that although I have a little bit of a ruffle there because I've got so much fabric, I don't have any pleats. So since I know that there's no pleats in the fabric, I can go ahead and take out my pins. So we'll remove these, and if you like, you can also trim that seam allowance, but the closer you trim the seam allowance, the more opportunity there is for that fabric to fray and ravel and your seam to come undone. So I tend to just trim diagonally over the corner of where my seam is, and my seam line is that bottom one, so I'm going to trim so it comes to a corner across the tip, just to remove some of that corner fabric, so when I turn it right side out, I'll have a nicer corner there, because I won't have as much fabric trying to fill in that corner. So get those out of the way. So now I'll flip that right side out, and I'll grab my little turner to go into the tip of the corner there. There we go. And trim this one, or turn this one right side out. Here we go, and then I'll press this flat, but there we go. So now the front is all sewn, so that edge is finished, and the collar is in with no pleats or turns, and this collar is just a little straight rounded collar. Oh, can you hear the kitty? She just jumped up on the back of my chair. Thank you, Alice. She usually does that, and then she'll try to claw me and crawl across my shoulders, which is always a joy. So we'll see how much I can get this turned before she tries her thing. So then when I'm actually, after I get the sleeves put in, then this facing, I like to tack down at the shoulders where the facing meets those shoulder seams. I'll just tack that by hand on both sides. And then on the seam allowance, because there's a seam allowance in the back, I'll tack that down, and that'll just kind of help hold that facing down so that it won't tend to ride up and flip once the garment is done. So, Alice, what are you doing? She's clawing up my chair, I guess. So that is the bodice part of the coat that's done so far. The next thing we're going to do is to put in the sleeves. So we'll open this up here so we can see what that looks like. So with the right side up, and then on the sleeve with the right side down, and once again you can stay stitch around the top edge so that it allows you to fit it into that opening, and then stay stitch around the opening of the armhole and snip just like we did on the neckline. I'm also going to, once I have that stay stitched, here we go, I will fold and snip the center so that I can match the center of the sleeve with the shoulder seam. So there we go. So I'll match that up, and then I usually will pin, just like I did on the collar, I will pin the center of the sleeve to the shoulder first, and then I will do, the only thing different is I don't always work all the way out, then I'll pin the very edge here, and then I work my way in towards the center and even out where those little gathers are, having most of the gathers, if there is any gathering, up towards the very top of the shoulder, because I don't want a lot of gathering down here on the side of the front of the bust. I want the gathering to only be at the top of the shoulder, so that way if there is any gathering, it'll end up being back here. So I'll go ahead and do all that prep stitching, and then I will come back to the camera and we'll go ahead and get one pinned in so you can see how that looks. Now that the sleeves are put in, there's no wrinkles or pleats or anything, so the sleeves are put in. So the next thing to do will be to open up the jacket so that we have it inside out, like so. And I'm going to start at the hem of one sleeve and sew from the hem to the underarm. Then I'll pivot down at where the seams meet, and then I'll pivot down and sew down to the hemline of the jacket on both sides. And once that is done, then all that's left is to hem the jacket and then to do any finishing work for buttons or snaps. So we'll get the sleeves put together and then turn it right side out and come back to the camera. And now we have the jacket put together. The sleeves are all sewn, and I went ahead and serged the edge, and I went ahead and hemmed it. When you hem, I always take the facing and fold it back against the right side to right side, so the 1/4 inch seam, then flip it back, and then that gives a nice finished corner on the bottom as well as the one on the top, and then this will naturally turn up to that same seam allowance, so you can go ahead and do the hem, and then we'll go ahead and flip it right side out. Here we go. I can get a hold of the sleeve there. There's one sleeve. And the second sleeve. Okay, then this of course will turn in like so. There we go. And I did go ahead, and when I pressed the seam allowance for the sleeves, I pressed that seam allowance toward the sleeve, and then all the other seam allowances, it's just kind of my general practice that I always press the seam allowances from the front towards the back. So these seam allowances were all pressed to go back towards the back, and these ones towards the back. It's just kind of what I do to give consistency so that it kind of all lays the same way. But so here is our little jacket, and all that needs to be done is to tack in that facing and then put on the buttons or snaps, or I haven't quite decided what I want to do for finishing on there. I'm not sure if I'm going to go with a black or just silver little buttons. I'll kind of look and see what I have. So we'll get that finish work done, the handwork, and then the next thing is to go ahead and put it on the doll, and we'll see how it looks. So here is the finished jacket. I'll go ahead and spin her around. So I went ahead and added the little decorative, just little rhinestone buttons that are on with snaps. So let's see if I can do this with one hand while holding the camera. There we go. Yeah, I couldn't undo it with one hand with the camera and with the other hand. So, and then the little rhinestone on her necklace, the little rhinestone on her neckband matches the little stones that we put on the coat. Let's see if I can back up. Hopefully that'll focus well. It's hard to tell on my little screen. And then I did use black snaps, so they're not as noticeable as if as they would be if they were silver. And so yeah, the little print top kind of adds a little bit of contrast. And then of course we have the skirt that we did in a previous video. There's also a pattern for pants and a lined vest that are kind of the completion of this little outfit. Okay, I'm back. So the stand, the little saddle part that's up underneath her fell down, and so she was getting really wobbly. But here is the pleat. So it does have an open pleat, and this is the underlay that lays under the pleat there when it hangs down. And I just used my little, I have a little tiny iron for when I'm sewing, and so that little tiny iron doesn't get really hot, and it's hard to get things to press nice. I need to use a bigger iron, so yeah, I should use a bigger one. I think in the future, if I make the skirt again, I will make these little triangle pieces longer so that they'll actually come up to about here rather than just at the end, because it has a little bit more of a limited flare than I wanted. So I'll probably add those in so they go up higher, and that would give just more of the look that I was going for. But anyway, there is the jacket completed on her little outfit. So thanks for coming along as we put this together. And if you have any questions or whatever, you can feel free to leave those in the comments, and I'll answer them to the best of my ability if you have anything that you're wondering about as you make the pattern. So happy sewing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.